It's your show. I have my PowerPoint ready, so whenever you'd like to start
Okay.
your intros, you can. It's fine with
Okay.
me.
Okay, that sounds great. So everybody's in and everybody can hear us. So hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Nancy Rowe of the Ridgefield Historical Society, here with Barrett Jones from the Ridgefield Library, who's co-hosting the event. I imagine that most of you already know the backstory of the presentation here today, but just to provide a little context to start. For many years, the Battle of Ridgefield has been studied and enjoyed and celebrated locally by local historians and local authors. In the town of Ridgefield, we have historic markers denoting important locations in the battle. Every 5 years, the battle is commemorated with a reenactment and associated events. In fact, we have the 245th anniversary celebrations coming up in just 1 month. In 2019, however, a local discovery prompted renewed and intense curiosity about the battle and took it to a whole new level. That discovery was, of course, the skeletons. There's nothing quite like a skeleton to command attention. In late 2019, human skeletal remains were discovered under a house near Main Street. The bodies were determined to not be present day, and while they're still being examined, they're believed to be the remains of soldiers who fought in the Battle of Ridgefield. That discovery strongly suggested that there was more to learn about the battle. That discovery also prompted a research grant from the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program, which was awarded to the Historical Society in collaboration with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and with the town of Ridgefield support. This grant allowed, for the first time ever, in-depth historic research by professional historians. And since then, much has been learned. The results of that first phase grant research are being presented tonight. Our speaker is Dr. David Naumec, field researcher and historian with Heritage Consultants. David has been immersed in this project for many months, working alongside the Historical Society and our project director, Sharon Dunphy, as well as SHPO. I think I can say with complete confidence that when you hear Dr. Naumec speaking tonight, you will recognize that he knows more about the Battle of Ridgefield and its context within the American Revolution than almost anybody else you've ever met. Probably more than anybody you've ever met, of course. Our format tonight is a presentation followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to send your questions in via chat, and we will bring them up at the end of the presentation. On that note, Dr. Naumec.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Testing. Things are going well. Thanks for that great introduction. That's a lot to live up to, but we will guarantee there will be at least hopefully some new information for even the most well-read researcher into this event, the Battle of Ridgefield. So I'd like to, on behalf of Heritage Consultants, again, thank Ridgefield Historical Society, the town of Ridgefield, for having us tonight. And for each and every one of you that have signed up for this event, we have quite the great turnout, and I'm looking forward to, and the Historical Society is looking forward to sharing our findings with you today. So with that said, I am going to hopefully share screen and move on to our featured presentation here, our discussion of the Battle of Ridgefield. Most of the information I'd like to share is going to be up on the screen here. So as the Ridgefield Library had advertised, and also thank you for the Ridgefield Library for hosting this, co-hosting this. This is Reconstructing the April 27th, 1777 Battle of Ridgefield. And there's a number of partners involved in this study. We'll discuss a number of them today. I should have had an entire page of acknowledgements because really this is a group effort in addition to the research team at Heritage Consultants. And at the bottom of the screen there, I'd like to call attention to my other co-researchers who've been leading up the effort here, Dr. Kevin McBride, who may or may not be with us here tonight, and David George, the director of Heritage Consultants, and all of the contemporary maps that you'll be seeing here that are included in our technical report have been done by William Keegan. So enjoy, and let's move forward with our presentation today and get this moving here. So with that said, if there's questions that pop up, feel free to chat them or send them to our moderator. There will be opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask some questions, and I can elaborate. And there's just so much that could be shared in regards to this project. I tried to boil it down to about as much material as I could fit into this hour and a half presentation. So generally, we're going to start looking at project background. A lot of that was already covered by Nancy Rowe, and the research process, generally what has been going on over the past year, year and a half. And that will be summed up in the battle narrative / findings, discussion history of the event, which we'll focus on and look at the maps and have a liberal use of contemporary military historical art that is chosen to help make a point, bring a little animation to this process, and to bring the history to light. So with that said, I will also discuss the next phase of research, because this is only one phase of a multi-year process, really exciting effort that's going to be taking place again right at the beginning of this 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the independence of the United States. So with that said, if I can again get this moving on here, a lot of this was covered by Nancy, so it saves me a lot of time in the introduction, which was just wonderful. So I'm going to sort of move ahead, but not to belabor the point. But these events specifically of April 27th, not to mention the overall Danbury expedition campaign, which we will be covering. You can't really study one without the other. Has impacted local, state, national history in a number of ways. Nancy addressed a number of them, and has been memorialized, commemorated from there on out, from, again, historical markers to literature to engravings to art, onwards and so forth. There are also a number of rich local oral traditions, early town histories, veterans interviews, local interviews, artifacts, and an intact historical landscape that help provide tangible links to this important event in American history in the earliest days of the United States, and local history here in Connecticut. One of only a few land battles fought here in the state. We'll see a number of these monuments. We'll discuss commemorations. There are museums in Ridgefield between the Historical Society and the Keeler Tavern. And I can only imagine there'll be more sort of history and exhibits and products that come out of this project that one can look forward to in the future. Archaeological discoveries have been mentioned, and there have been more since. No, not more burials, but more artifacts that have been found related directly to the Battle of Ridgefield, thanks to the efforts of some local historians, detectorists, Ridgefield Historical Society members. And I will get into shortly this 2020 National Park Service grant that this is a product of, that we're enjoying here at the moment. And again, the anniversary of the battle is now. It's coming up shortly, in about a month from now. So you'll hear more of that from the Historical Society. You'll hear more from myself, I'm sure, and other historians, and there'll just be a lot to enjoy for those of us that are interested in this important piece of American history. So all of this historical research that's summed up in this presentation today is a result of this really fantastic program that is funded by the National Park Service, your tax dollars at work, American Battlefield Protection Program, ABPP for short, if you ever hear me spit that out, or if you see that in any slides. And at some point, do look it up online. It's been around for, I don't know, 2 decades now, probably late 90s perhaps, and originally was a program designed to broadly promote the preservation of significant battlefields on American soil, but largely the earliest grants, if you went look back year after year, what was awarded were generally American Civil War and American Revolutionary War projects, which Ridgefield clearly fits right into. So it's also a priority, I should say, is given to battlefields or battlefield sites that are threatened by any number of development or events that could impact the battlefield. And it's also designed to protect battlefield sites and these associated sites that are critical to American history, but perhaps overlooked or haven't been perhaps investigated or commemorated to maybe a full extent in the past. Encourages protection, management, interpretation of these historical sites, raises awareness for the importance of preserving these sites for future generations. And it's a big part of it too, to raise the visibility of these important battlefields, in this case, Ridgefield, which again, in town and in the local area is very well known, but frankly, not so much in the rest of Connecticut. I'm talking to you today from the far reaches of Eastern Connecticut over here in Windham County. And, for many years, I was well aware of Fort Griswold, burning New London, but that's kind of, wasn't so much aware of what was happening over in Western Connecticut, right? So this hopefully will bridge that gap and spread the word throughout New England as well. And for Connecticut, there's been battlefield projects done since about 2007, if I recall. Dr. Kevin McBride had really, and the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, I should say, through the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, had really spearheaded this battlefield conflict archaeology here in the Northeast, frankly, Connecticut for sure, New England, with Pequot War projects, Battle of Mystic Fort, investigating and identifying the first English military installation in Connecticut at Saybrook, down in Western Connecticut, for those of you out that way today, down in Southport, the last Battle of the Pequot War, again, was studied by Dr. McBride and myself as the chief historian and archaeologist in many cases. The burning of Essex in War of 1812, and also the Battle of Stonington Borough in the War of 1812 as well, have been recently investigated by Dr. McBride. And now we have finally bridging that gap, filling the gap, the Revolutionary War project, the Battle of Ridgefield. So here we are being funded by the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program. Fantastic program that's only increased in funding through Congress over the years, and seems to be supported by both sides of the aisle, surprisingly. And in any case, there's also 3 phases to the American Battlefield Protection Program grant. And phase 1 is what we have at Heritage Consultants and Ridgefield Historical Society have more or less completed at the moment. And this is the planning and consensus building phase of these grants, where you are, one conducts research, documentary research, artifact research, in an effort to, through the historical record and the landscape and oral traditions, identify prospective battlefield locations. I mean, it's pretty clear in Ridgefield, there's markers everywhere for a first, second, third engagement, yet there's cannonballs and artifacts strewn all up and down Ridgebury Road, New Salem Road. So there's clearly a lot of actions taking place outside of those 3 known engagements, right? So what else can be identified? What boundaries can ultimately be formed? But in this case, identifying prospective sites, determining if the landscape's intact or not, creating mapping, military terrain analysis, you see a lot of that tonight, and really importantly, obtaining at this early time permissions from landholders to conduct future archaeology, a battlefield survey on their property, because the Battle of Ridgefield, any of these battlefield sites, consist of dozens, most often hundreds of individual landholders, and also state and local stakeholders, right? So there's a lot of people you got to get on board, and Ridgefield Historical Society and the local community has done a great job at this early time of getting together a core group of permissions, and they're always looking for more. And you can reach out to Ridgefield if you find yourself along this battlefield route we're looking at today. Now, phase 2, which is what Ridgefield's going to be moving into, is the site identification, documentation, where you take this historical analysis that we are presenting today and ground truthing it, actually going to those prospective sites once landholder permission is secured, and doing generally metal detecting and subsurface testing, generally looking for metal objects, musket balls, cannonballs, equipment that can be used to create these boundaries of where actions occurred. The Park Service doesn't want every single artifact found, because therefore you don't have a battlefield landscape anymore to protect if you've just uncovered every artifact. So that one needs to find just enough to tell the next phase of understanding if these hypotheses you're going to listen to tonight, if they're correct or not. It's going to be the archaeological record that will prove this or not in the end. There's always surprises. And Dr. McBride and I always like to say that, you always have to challenge your assumptions. You're always wrong until, I guess, proven otherwise. So phase 3 would be the interpretation and education, which is where the Park Service will fund the creation, the development of the creation of, but not fabrication of, like historical signage, exhibits, perhaps different publications and educational programming, things of that nature. So it's a really exciting grant in general. I know you're not here to hear about this entire grant and the depths of it, but just to let you know, this is going to be an ongoing process. You're hearing about the research, and really only research tonight. So these phase 1 objectives, again, when you're seeing some of the outcomes on the right, historical engravings, at least in this case of David Worcester, some artifacts that were found by our local detectorists and historians, and at the bottom, some of these maps you're going to be seeing today. But identify materials that are there from the time of the battle, local, state, federal records, British accounts, newspapers are rich sources, and there's strong oral traditions in the area, interviews, veterans accounts that when looked at as a whole, really provide a lot of information on this event. But looked at individually, as some of the Ridgefield Historical Society volunteers are finding out, looking at pension records, there might only be a sentence, a bit of information, a little bit of insight. But again, you bring it all together, and it helps build these narratives that we're looking at here. Look at secondary source materials, early town histories, stuff written after the fact, but again, steeped in local lore, local traditions, and stories of stories. But in many cases, almost all cases, these local oral traditions tend to pan out once you cross-reference them with the historical record and the archaeological record, as Kevin and I often find out. Historical maps, that's Keegan's world right there. Bill Keegan, our historical cartographer, and it's really important to figure out to gather as many different local maps clearly as possible, spanning time, and if they might only be chunks of this entire route, they might only be certain areas of road, but as Mr. Keegan always likes to explain, again, we're kind of connecting the dots here and building the maps and the roads in between, these existing sources we have. You'll see some those results today. And artifacts, monuments, signage, anything there that speaks to where things took place and these boundaries. Importantly, core areas, contributing properties. This is language from the grant, but we'll be investigating some of this and seeing what we have identified as core areas, essentially first, second, third engagement, and some other areas of combat we've identified. The Park Service, I should also mention, is really only interested in documenting areas where fighting took place, and not so much, say, other areas of like let's say encampments or short-term stops or things like that. Although they're important to the story, so they're considered contributing properties, what we're really after are these core areas and those battlefield boundaries. And again, landholder permission, which I'd say is a success. Everything, check, check, check. It's been a success, I think, phase one in general. Use all of this collected data to form a final technical report. At some point in the near future, there will be a public copy, I'm sure, of available online for people to take a look at. And you're seeing a lot of the results of that again here tonight. One area of research as well that just I can't get into as great depth as our veterans research, but there's an ongoing effort by the Ridgefield Historical Society and myself to study veterans records at large, determine how many soldiers were in fact mobilized. We're interested in the English as well, but on the American side, for the Danbury expedition, Battle of Ridgefield, and how many of those men can be identified as soldiers of color, of African, Native American, mixed race descent. American, Revolutionary War records are sort of remarkably vague when it comes to descriptions of race. Often the veterans' pensions are a little more enlightening, or more genealogical research is involved, but there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for certain individuals for various reasons we could tie to this battle. But the problem is that we might come back to several times is the incomplete nature of these records and the great work that has been done by authors like Stephen Darley and Keith Jones and others to reconstruct records. They'll tell you themselves how difficult it is. So it's an ongoing effort to identify records, to pay respect for those who fought for the defense of Ridgefield, Danbury, and the birth of our nation, and to also learn more about the forces that fought there. So in any case, a good number of these Connecticut troops that we aren't discussing in detail today are undoubtedly men of color, and they're just waiting for us to rediscover that fact. Can't get into great detail into the historical context of the years before the revolution. People that have studied this event or early American history, we'll go back to the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War essentially is really kind of like the birth of the like maybe the beginning of the different factors that led to growing grievances, tensions in the North American British colonies that eventually led to a revolution against the crown, right? So without getting into those great details, that's kind of a review of your U.S. History 1 courses, revolutionary courses. You can maybe high school courses of events like the Proclamation of 1763, the different Sugar Acts, Stamp Acts, different Quartering Acts, Boston Massacre, different events leading to rising tensions, eventually the closing of Boston Harbor, that will turn a fraction of the American population, very loyal subjects, formally against the greater empire. I think it's something I always find interesting to think about, as many historians will consider the revolution in terms of thirds, maybe a third of colonists were for this crazy idea of revolting against this very powerful empire. A third were very loyal. And we're going to talk about those loyal British citizens today in great detail and many different aspects, and loyalist sentiments and loyalist soldiers. And then also a third that just, are trying to keep their heads down and try not to get involved, or just seeing which way the wind goes. The war begins more or less, as many of us know, in 1775. And generally, I guess you could say it goes relatively well for the Americans, between the Siege of Boston being successful ultimately in taking over Fort Ticonderoga, as the British didn't realize the hostilities have commenced, and gathering a bunch of ordnance that can be used around Boston. Battle of Bunker Hill, many are familiar with, the failed attempt at Quebec, but some of these early, I guess, arguably American victories, maybe give a false sense of maybe a quick end to the war for those American colonists willing to revolt. But within that year, the Crown was able to mobilize and start sending more troops to the rebellious colonies. And in 1776, the war isn't going as well for the Americans, for sure. It's kind of an iffy time period. It's kind of amazing the revolution even was successful, but following that Declaration of Independence to Americans themselves, to the Crown, and to the world, there's a disaster, I guess, for the American perspective of the Battle of Long Island, where much of the American armies nearly destroyed, pretty complete defeat of Washington's army. They're able to more or less pull it together by the Battle of Harlem Heights after a successful evacuation of Long Island. And luckily, one of those what ifs of history, just before Continental Army enlistments expire at the end of the year, Washington just sort of, well, it has nothing else to lose, launches this attack at the Hessian, the German mercenary garrison at Trenton, and taking that garrison with little or no loss, great American victory, and others follow, which are much needed morale boosters for this American cause in its infancy. So this brings us into 1777 and sort of zooming in now to Ridgefield and well, the events that bring us to Danbury and Ridgefield, right? Howe's campaign of 1777, many historians will label it as such, basically pursuing the American army and focusing on urban areas like New York and ultimately Pennsylvania, but trying to at least contain this rebellion as much as possible. After an American victory at Princeton, there is locally a smaller scale raid which will precede the events at Danbury and at Ridgefield, the Peekskill raid, which is about half the British forces that were at Danbury were at Peekskill, so about 1,000, let's say. And it was, again, another Continental Army depot, which was loosely defended, and the British were able to take it, destroy it. And there was very little contact with American troops. It wasn't very much inland. It was very close to the Hudson, if you're familiar with Peekskill, New York. And there was naval support, right? So it was a pretty quick affair. Now, on top of that, and other factors, which we'll talk about shortly, led to the targeting of the next very prominent American Continental depot, which is up in Danbury, further inland, thought to be relatively well protected, and that if anybody's going to attack it, they'd probably attack it from the Hudson, but it would be a gamble, right? So planning the Danbury expedition, here we have the two British commanders of forces in North America, Sir William Howe, and what many historians attribute to the planner of the operation, General William Tryon, former governor of New York. So by many accounts and reading Tryon's and Howe's correspondences, it appears that General Tryon suggests this operation in Danbury. Also, being from New York and familiar with the recruiting, with existence of and recruiting of loyalist forces, that is New Englanders, New Yorkers, Northeasterners, loyal to the Crown, thinking revolution is crazy, wanting nothing to do with it. But in the case of Connecticut, being driven from their homes and seeking refuge in Long Island, New York, bringing stories of perhaps exaggerated stories, but not all that exaggerated stories of strong loyalist support in Western Connecticut. It was definitely harbored there. You can read in newspapers, local accounts, and state trials, at this time, actually, the court records. But in any case, this is one of the factors, believing that Western Connecticut was very much loyalist, that perhaps marching a relatively large army through that area, taking Danbury, showing the strength of the king's forces, it might turn others away from rebellion and towards the Crown. Not unlike, if one studies the American Civil War, the thought behind Lee's first invasion of the North, and it results in Antietam, Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg. It's thought that Maryland might go to the Confederacy because there's a lot of loyal, Southern-leaning pro-rebels in Maryland. That's kind of the same thought here in Western Connecticut. So troops involved are approximately 2,000. When that number is thrown around, I and others always thought it was like maybe a higher estimate, but really when breaking down the forces, it seems those American accounts are pretty close to right. You got about 1,800 infantry that are detached from New York units. We'll look at that shortly. A very small contingent of mounted troops known as dragoons that will be advanced guards, flankers, just really quick eyes and ears. 6 3-pound cannons, which with 12 or 16 artillerists per piece, you use about 96 artillerists, so that's often overlooked, and a number of wagoneers or / teamsters, civilians hired to drive baggage and wagons and extra ammunition carts, and the British need enough of that to sustain an army on this campaign, which could possibly take several days. That's more or less what's being proposed. So there's a long list it's been published multiple places, well-known, detailed list of the different British infantry units and the numbers detached to join this force. So different units around New York are asked to, I would assume, handpick 250 troops. And from these 6 different regiments of foot, British regulars, these would probably be grenadiers, light infantry, some of the more veteran men who have already seen action, some of which at Lexington, Concord, and some of these other battles listed. So they're pretty veteran troops. Noteworthy is Major Montfort Brown's Corps of Loyalists, known as the Prince of Wales American Regiment, formerly. I'll often just refer to them as Brown's Corps, Brown's Loyalist Corps, but Prince of Wales American Regiment, 300 total. We'll have to keep continue our research into the Loyalist forces, and we're not quite sure the number of which were from Connecticut, but I suspect the researchers at Ridgefield and at Heritage can figure out something of more detail in the future. But perhaps 100 were from the local area, but others from New Jersey, New York, other displaced, dispossessed Loyalist refugees in the region. The 17th Light Dragoons, known as the 17th Lancers, probably 10, maybe upwards to 17 based on various accounts. And again, the Royal Artillery. Now, each of these British regiments in North America by 77, if I understand correctly, had 2 3-pound guns attached to them. They were often known as the battalion guns. So each one of these 6 regiments would have 2 cannons, and I suspect each one of these 6 guns is 1 gun detached from each one of those regiments, and they might be closely working with, say, the 15th Regiment. One of those six 3-pound guns was probably belongs to the 15th, another to the 23rd, another to the 4th, onwards, and so forth. More artillerists than I expected, at least 6 to work the gun, as little as 3 could work one of those small artillery pieces. About a 3-inch bore, very mobile, almost exclusively used during the American Revolution, not much after, perhaps a little bit before in the 7 Years' War. Highly mobile, easy to move around these rough New England roads, and a kind of a crew service weapon that took between 3 and 6, the full contingent being 6, and reservists that are helping wheel around the guns, lug the guns, run ammunition. If somebody's wounded, they can take their place. So it was interesting learning the usage of these artillery pieces, which play an important role in this battle. So let's actually get to it, as it's about 7:30 here, right? So Connecticut's invaded. The British fleets are on the move from New York and moving into Long Island to pick up the Loyalist Corps and moving into Long Island Sound. Some of the best work of this has really been done by an author, Damian Greenleaf Douglas, The Bridge Not Taken. That should be one of those must-haves in your Battle of Ridgefield library, as well as Call to Arms by Stephen Darley. Some great work on this prequel to Ridgefield. And we're just kind of going to give an overview and move on to the main event, because again, our focus is on the third day of this campaign. So General Howe, and whenever you see this sort of italicized text, it's generally primary sources. I try to include as many as possible for us. This is more than I can include, but several regiments, as we noted, were embarked in 12 transports, and they go from New York City, where the regulars are loaded on, to Long Island, where the loyalists are picked up and bound for Fairfield. Interestingly, noted by all the major historians, but often overlooked, is the fact that Howe and Tryon had a great feint planned, a decoy plan to draw the attention up the Hudson, or the Americans up towards the Hudson once again. So as you see here, a diversion was thought fit to be made at the same time up the North River, 12 transports in which a small corps of troops are embarked. And they anchored off of Dobbs Ferry, again, close enough to threaten what's left of Peekskill or what's being actually refitted at Peekskill and other areas on the Hudson. So for many American commanders, especially continental commanders, the attention is on the Hudson. So with that diversion, the real threat, those other transports are going to Long Island, and then throughout the evening heading along Long Island Sound towards Connecticut. By April 25th, those ships have anchored off of Cedar Point and began disembarking troops on Campo Beach. The Americans have had their Coast Guard watchers out there aware of the movement of these ships. They don't quite know where they're heading, but now Friday, 12:30 p.m., Brigadier General Gold Selleck-Silliman, who's in charge of the 4th Brigade Connecticut Militia, we'll hear more about Silliman, is at Campo Hill and notes and sends word out to other commanders in Worcester and Trumbull that 24 sail in the whole, 16 of them ships, so again, pretty close to the numbers. It's aware that the British are here. So he sends out, that he being Silliman, General Silliman, for all the companies of the 4th Regiment, others to come as fast as possible. And the specific orders are, as soon as you get 20-man companies together, just send them on the march with an officer. Just don't wait for the full regiment. As soon as you got 20-man companies, just send them marching. And the rendezvous point was generally around Fairfield. The Americans believed the attack was gonna, the target of the landing was this Fairfield proper. So the Connecticut troops are scrambling. The captain's log specifically says at 6 p.m. they land this 1st Division, they land the 2nd Division, 7 p.m. So how's that for fast British efficiency? Both divisions of 1,800 troops are landed. This doesn't take into account the artillery and other support and wagons and onwards, but the infantry is on the ground by 7 p.m. in control of Campo Hill, Bennett's Rocks, and just establishing a beachhead and protecting the rest of the landing. Lieutenant Robertson, who we'll hear a lot of as well, has a great account, being lieutenant in the Royal Engineers, who was on this operation from the very beginning, part of some of the early planning. Likely the author of a detailed map of the campaign that we'll see bits and pieces of. And again, just a great, sometimes hour by hour account of the Danbury expedition. So we'll see a lot of Robertson. So he's mentioning we immediately marched to the hills, and by the time the artillery and everything is landed, it's about 11 at night. So all the infantry's on the ground, the artillery, everything else, oxen, horses, wagons, whatever they have. And then they start marching immediately. Half hour after that, so about 11:30, one big column heading up generally a series of roads that'll be known as the Danbury Road. So here's the overall modern composite of modern town lines over some of the details of Robertson's map. So we have a few things going on here. But in any case, it's to orient ourselves in space. And the order of battle, that is the number of troops involved in this campaign, let alone the Battle of Ridgefield itself, is just mind-boggling. There's a lot of different Connecticut militia units that mobilize, some that were on the march but never made it to any of the actions on any of the days. There's New York militia that is active, and there's just a lot to keep track of. And early on, myself and Keith Jones, the author of Firmest Against the Crowd, sort of decided when kind of conceptualizing this, we'll just also mention the most active, well-known, the largest mobilized units, and also kind of drop the commanding officers because, in terms of labeling these units, because it's also unclear what commanding officers were even on the ground, or if there's just junior officers leading some of these units. There's a lot to be desired in terms of completeness of records, but the 4th Brigade is the main actor here in our story, mobilizing here out of this Fairfield County, consisting of the 4th, 9th, 13th, 16th regiments. Again, fractions of these units. It's not the complete roster. Every man enlisted in 1777 up to April did not turn out. At best a half, likely a third or less of many of these units were able to mobilize in time for this pursuit, let alone the Battle of Ridgefield. And the most Americans were in action the last day of the campaign on the 26th. General David Worcester is the commander of all Connecticut militia forces. He's alerted, being, I believe, in Fairfield at the time, and comes to assume command and ascend commands to other militia brigade commanders to be prepared, because it's still unclear where the British are going. The British forces are divided into 2 brigades. We'll hear a lot about that throughout the story here, consisting of about 750 troops each and 3 guns each. And each of them have their own baggage and wagon trains. At the lead of the column, at least on the first day, and perhaps in the second, so the 25th to the 26th towards Danbury, the Bronze Loyalist Corps is leading the way, again, putting these loyalist local men at the head of the column, a number of which are from Western Connecticut, know these towns, know these roads, know some of the people along the way, these houses. They will be leading, being at the vanguard of this British Army, followed by General James Agnew's brigade. He'll be at the head of those particular units, 3 cannons at the front. And then their baggage, followed by William Erskine's brigade, the most veteran and the overall effective commander, frankly, of British forces. Erskine is going to be calling the shots and devising the strategies. Tryon's a figurehead. Agnew's veteran, but Erskine is really the senior officer. And again, those regiments, 3 cannons, the dragoons are checking out side roads, flanking. They're in the front, the rear. They're all over the place. And again, there will be a march up along the Danbury Road. There will be initial fighting or skirmishing or shots fired at the British by American militia and a handful of Continental soldiers that happen to be on the coastline in the area here. But after that initial skirmish north of Campo Hill, there's not much action for the British as they march up towards Easton and Reading. Ultimately, there's a small action that Robertson mentions, again, around the town of Weston Easton, that actually slowed the British for a little bit. We're not quite sure who was involved there, but American prisoners were taken. At Reading, the troops, the British rest for a bit before moving on to Danbury, which they'll reach around 4 o'clock. And by all accounts, they're at least finding some loyalist support in the Reading area, being entertained by some of the loyalists in that particular area. We're also arresting, notable patriots or rebels, I guess. So with that said, the burning of Danbury, the Americans, just to back up real quick, find out Silliman determines, again, there's Americans on horseback everywhere trying to keep an eye on the British and not get too close to be captured. But Silliman realizes that the British are in fact marching north to Danbury. Worcester also suspects that. Fairfield is not the target. So now the Americans that have been mobilizing around Fairfield begin to pursue the British marching north. And there's about a 7-mile head start the British have. So the Americans aren't going to be able to catch up. It's going to be a driving rain. It's going to be a pretty tough march. It's going to render most firearms, flintlock firearms, useless from the weather. So I just mentioned that. Silliman is going to, with Worcester's approval as well, everyone's going to be marching as fast as possible up north. Around the town of Danbury, Continental General Benedict Arnold, who is in the region, catches up with the Connecticut forces and joins the command. And with Worcester ranking, Arnold is going to be taking over command of most of the Connecticut troops shortly. Silliman will be deferring to Arnold. Arnold's reputation is a noteworthy, determined commander. Will also, demand respect from those Connecticut troops. So at Danbury, there's very few forces there to protect the arsenal. That decoy that we discussed shortly, a bit earlier, that's anchored off Dobbs Ferry, served its intended purpose. The commander, General McDougall of Peekskill, requested reinforcements from Danbury of all places. So only hours earlier, literally, most of the defenders of Danbury marched west towards Peekskill to reinforce the Americans there. That only left Colonel Jedediah Huntington of the 1st Connecticut Continental Line, Continental troops, only about 50 troops at Danbury, along with around 100 militia of the 16th Connecticut. Joseph Platt Cook is the colonel from town, and the 16th was on site early at the arsenal. And there was a small depot guard as well. But again, we're talking less than 200 troops in the face of upwards to 1,800 British infantry closing in. So they try to do the best they can to remove some of these military stores, but there's just too much. So some of the best tents, the important leather goods and tools, but they didn't have enough wagons, not enough troops. And before you know it, the British who are at Reading are just entering Danbury at 4 p.m. And the Americans have little choice but to move out of town and take up positions on some of the hills outside Danbury. And there's some limited skirmishing. There is some fighting. There's some British wounded and killed, and as well with Americans. And it'd be interesting to study that in more detail. But we did not focus on Danbury as much as we did with Ridgefield. So with that said, the British immediately started gathering these supplies, and they also find there's too much to haul out of there with the wagons they have, and too much to even drag into the streets and burn. So when pretty soon the British start burning down the structures that these supplies are stored in. So these warehouses and churches and some private homes. And this conflagration, the flames start to spread and catch to a number of different houses in town. And the flames can be seen in Reading, where American troops are under Worcester, and Silliman and Arnold are starting to mass. So something that became clear, about as clear as mud, was the American mobilization occurring throughout the region, because the alarm went out for different militia brigades, different companies. The 4th Brigade under Silliman was most highly mobilized. They turned out in the greatest numbers, but there's units from looking at our order of battle we put together from various other militia companies and brigades, 6th Brigade, 17th Connecticut. Others are turning out that are north of Danbury, northeast of Danbury, as well as south and east, and New Yorkers from the west. And depending on the direction they're coming from, it sort of depends where they're most likely going to rendezvous with massing American forces. The Bethel group is not on this map, but just south of Danbury, Bethel, which was part of the town of Danbury at the time, is where Worcester, Silliman, Arnold, and about 600 American troops are massing. But there's also Cook's 16th Connecticut. Others from the 13th, based on various records, are also linking up with Cook. So there might be 150 or more, 200 Americans out on those hills. The others from the 17th Connecticut, as mentioned, are appearing. The 1st Connecticut is keeping an eye on things. And one of the little known kind of, unsung units of this whole Danbury expedition, especially the Battle of Ridgefield, are going to be the Westchester units. In this case, the 3rd Westchester New York Militia, maybe upwards to 60, maybe a little more or less, number of which are mounted themselves on horseback. We're able to really quickly move in from the Salems, North Salem, South Salem, back then, move through Ridgebury and bring up, bring themselves up in Danbury on the western outskirts on Myery Brook. And as fate would have it, they would be in front of the British, as they move out of town. But we have the 3rd Westchester there as well. So there's a number of different units mobilizing. It's hard to keep track. It's hard to estimate numbers. I'm always trying to work this out with others at Ridgefield and with Keith Jones, and just trying to, a lot of this is going to come down to additional pension research and placing units under certain commanders. And that's what Ridgefield is working on, Historical Society at the moment, a number of really, great volunteers, hopefully some of which are watching today. So Worcester believes there's basically 2 routes that, the British are going to choose from. There's going to be the same route they came from, heading back south the exact same way to Campo Beach. And so Americans are massing at Bethel just in case. They can react quickly if that is the case. Arnold and others as well also believe that maybe they're just going to march west and go completely west towards Peekskill, as McDougall fears, and link up with those ships down by Dobbs Ferry. So that decoy it's still working, and really it's a consideration Arnold specifically is thinking about. So there's 2 specific routes Americans don't really know. There's a lot of eyes on the British around Danbury, as this graphic tries to demonstrate. The main American forces are south at Bethel, and they begin to split into 2 divisions by 6 o'clock in the morning as they're watching, the flames of Danbury, and they're trying to dry their muskets off. Worcester takes about 200 of the 600. Arnold's division, which includes Silman, grabs another, takes 400, the larger, clearly of the 2. And the plan from the very beginning, as evident from, speaking of volunteers, I hope they're watching, one of the Ridgefield Historical Society volunteers found a phenomenal, never published letter of Worcester, of all things, directing American commanders early on the 26th on his plans. It's not, it was up at auction. It's in a private paper collection now, but we have a transcription and a copy of the original. So thank you, Ridgefield Historical Society volunteers. And General Worcester essentially notes exactly what I'm laying out here, that there's 2 ways they're going to march. He suspects that the British are going to head towards Ridgebury, south to Ridgefield, because there are some military stores in Ridgefield. He's convinced that the Loyalists are really driving the column and their intelligence, so the Loyalists would know, or they know by now, that there's military stores not only in Danbury, but in Ridgefield. He also mentions Wilton, and he mentions another place, but he calls it. Basically, he anticipates where the British will in fact march. But at this point, nobody really knows, so they split up their divisions. And Worcester directs other American militia that are starting to still respond, not to march north to Danbury, but to begin to mass around Saugatuck this early on, which explains later American strategy, I suppose. But with that said, the whole plan that will ultimately be the Battle of Ridgefield is that the American forces are going to try to slow the British as much as possible, not defeat them in open battle, because it's not likely with 600, maybe 7, 8, 9, maybe 1,000 if they're lucky when everything comes together. But the British force is twice as large and twice as veteran, let's say, right? These are British regulars. So the point is to slow the British as long as possible to allow the rest of the American militia to mobilize, have the best chance possible to cut them off no matter what direction they take. So that's the plan. Okay, so British forces are on the march. I notice it's probably getting on 8 o'clock here. So let's see what I can do in the next 20 minutes or so. And stupefy you with some graphics here. The thought is, again, now there's those two possible routes of march with those black arrows, might be hard to see on the map, which focuses, you can see American troops around Bethel, little figure that's the 3rd Westchester, let's say, to give them credit. But it's pretty clear by about 9 in the morning where the British are going to march. This little asterisk here is to remind me to mention that it became pretty clear in this research, thanks to good accounts of time from Lieutenant Robertson on the British and Silliman and Arnold and others on the American side. We had several events that both the British and Americans give us time estimates on, and almost at not almost every single time we can cross-reference an event, like the British mentioned when they leave Danbury, there's an hour difference. So in this case, Robertson writes we left at 8 a.m. Yet Silliman, Arnold, and others write at 9 o'clock we discovered the British were marching west towards Ridgebury. And there's other examples of that in other parts of this study. And it became pretty clear, but hard to find good academic studies of, that the British at their own time, on almost probably a British naval time that's kind of standard across the empire and the naval, the British Navy, and or New York's on a different time. But it seems to also be the case in the War of 1812, these other studies that Dr. Kevin McBride was involved in. So it's not that it took an hour for the Americans to figure out the British had left Danbury. It's just they're an hour different in reporting their time. So in any case, the British say 8, multiple American sources say 9, and this occurs in other parts of the study. So I guess being American-centric and focusing on the Americans, the heroes of our story, I guess my opinion, 9 o'clock it is. So from Silliman's standpoint and Arnold's perspective, at 9 o'clock, the British marched west along Myrie Brook, and the road is still there today, pretty much unimpacted over the years. You can drive it and get a sense of the landscape, perhaps the general landscape of what it was like back around 1777. But this column's a half a mile long, and it's led by the Dragoons. You have Agnew's brigade followed with wagons, followed by Erskine's brigade with wagons. Things are serious now. Tryon was hoping to stay an extra day in Danbury. He thought, maybe he'd be recruiting extra loyalists or he would be well received. But it became pretty clear from the hills around Danbury that Americans were massing, and the loyalists knew that they had to get moving. So the British are moving at a brisk pace. And this American local tradition from Ridgebury, recorded in the early 1900s in a town history, describes exactly the British arrangement of light horsemen, then the cannons, then the main body, 3 more cannons in the rear. The British themselves describe this arrangement. So it's pretty interesting, the veracity of the oral history. The 3rd Westchester tried to slow the British, according to a couple of pension accounts. They mentioned being in front of the British as they're marching west out of Danbury. From the perspective of these New Yorkers, for all they know, the British column is heading towards North Salem. So they're really putting up a fight. Somebody in local Danbury history, early histories, I should say, note that somebody tore up some bridges around like Fox Run sort of brook area. Maybe it was this 3rd Westchester, but they were a tough group, and they started to lay ambushes apparently for the British along Myrie Brook and George Washington Highway. Robinson mentions pretty early that the militia began to harass us early on the 27th, increasing every mile, galling us from their houses and fences. And it's kind of an interesting thought and quote. And the British had a policy of burning down any sort of structure Americans took cover in. If they were fired on from houses, they would burn the entire house down. There's a few houses along this battlefield route that were said to be burnt. It makes one can suspect that that's probably why. But again, not early on. So one could imagine perhaps the New Yorkers setting up ambushes, firing and falling back the next ambush. There's only 60 of them, perhaps maybe 80, and the whole British Army's coming their way. So there's also a local tradition that these light horsemen went all the way to the New York border, giving more kind of evidence that, you know, perhaps it was the 3rd Westchester that was involved in the fighting. The horsemen are taking shots at people near the New York state line, which is only like, I think maybe 2 miles at that point from Ridgebury Center. Robertson writes, after getting to Ridgebury, the entire column goes south now. It's pretty clear they're not going to the Hudson. They're heading back south towards the Sound the way they came. And Robertson mentions that the Americans, whoever they were, a noteworthy group of Americans, not just people shooting from behind stone walls and houses, made their appearance at Ridgebury Hill about 5 miles from Danbury. Robertson's really good with these miles. I mean, he's also map making. And they fired at the rear at a great distance. They did us little harm. And it's based on the mileage and everything. And those of you that know Ridgebury Hill and have kind of driven that section of North Salem Road, I think it's that real steep, it makes the most sense that as one starts to descend the hill, that's probably where whoever these Americans were kind of ran up on the British and maybe fired at 100 yards or better at them. So in any case, they did little harm, but it's not like they did no harm. So they've been some minor skirmishing. And this is something that's not really recognized or noted or commemorated. The earliest shots of really the Battle of Ridgebury are occurring along Myrie Brook, and for certain on Ridgebury Hill. The British are getting jumpy. There's a local a tradition that one of the old houses of a captain that name escapes me, near the Congregational Church in Ridgebury, as the British went by, some of the inhabitants looked out the window and the British took shots at them, you know, thinking perhaps that they were American militia about to fire on them. So the British are, you know, taking a lot of pot shots, but there was a lot of time for Americans to think about ambushing them as they were burning Danbury. Here's a larger map of our Tryon's route that we know for sure that he took, and a pretty strong belief on Silliman's route from this common point at Bethel. And harder to reconstruct was Worcester's division, and you know, really no one has kind of tackled it. William Keegan and his wife Chris Keegan did a ton of work, and I should also say I lent a hand as well, trying to figure out exactly what this overland route is, and kind of what you're looking at in the 1770s landscape is 3 major roads of how you would get towards greater Danbury from the New York border. There was kind of always what was described as a lower route, a mid route, and the upper route. The upper route was more or less this George Washington Highway, Myrie Brook. This lower route was a series of roads that were known as the Danbury Road, as you know, coming from the south. And Worcester's middle route is today a series of, I guess you'd call them like back roads and some discontinued roads through some, I believe, state forests. And we included a real detailed kind of like road by road route in the end of the report. Too much to describe here, but difficult to reconstruct. So around 9 o'clock, Americans also, or at this point I should have actually said around 10 o'clock. So around 9 o'clock, the Americans know the British leave Danbury. Around 10 o'clock, they know for sure they're heading south. So immediately, efforts are made to mobilize the troops, parade the men, and start marching along these routes to intercept the British and to start slowing them. About this time at 10 a.m., when word gets out which direction they're taking, reinforcements haphazardly show up. The 6th Massachusetts Continentals, 140 troops under Lieutenant Colonel Calvin Smith appear. They were en route to Peekskill. Again, the decoy was drawing troops from all over. They realized the real alarm was Danbury. They fell in, but showed up with no ammunition. According to the Connecticut Current, soon after arrived 2,000 cartridges from Peekskill. Now that everybody understood where the immediate threat was. So presumably these cartridges are passed out to the Continentals, the 1st Connecticut, the 6th Mass. But the question mark is, and that could have been done rapidly. I mean, is this happening before Worcester and Sullivan march out? So the question we always have is, once they're resupplied, do any of these Continental troops fall in with seemingly Worcester's brigade, who's only, they only have 200 troops compared to Arnold with 400, or do they remain in Danbury to put out the fires and to, who knows, to salvage what they can? It's just a huge mystery. Pension work's been done on the 6th Mass and then also Massachusetts of their regimental history, and there's no indication. There is some, suggestive materials in the pension records that some 1st Connecticut troops were with Worcester during the battle. So at this point, we're going to be wishy-washy and say some or elements of these Continental units likely fell in with Worcester, and there's newspaper evidence to that effect that Worcester was in control of the militia and Continental. So there were some Continental units with them. It could have been a handful of the units that mobilized early, or the men that mobilized early the day before. Who knows? But by 11 o'clock, again, news reaches the Americans, the fact that the British really are going south. So the divisions, begin their pursuit. And the plan is for Arnold, with even at this time a larger division, to be a blocking force to try to find ways to slow the advance of the British, where Worcester will harass them, will attack them, will hit them in the rear. So to also slow them, not to overtake them, but to slow the column, to allow other Americans to arrive, have a better chance of just perhaps capturing the entire group, because they're really far inland at this time with no support and no reinforcements coming, no resupply. So in any case, Worcester's division might be up to about 400 men at this time, picking up some from Danbury, at least the other Connecticut militia, Cook and others. It's still all speculation. As the American forces are moving, and as it's a little after 8, I should really get moving here, Tryon's army rests notably near Mamanasco Lake on North Salem Road. Am I there? Yes. And again, local tradition, that nothing in the British records themselves, but many different accounts from locals in this area of Ridgefield state that the British were butchering up cattle, at least, that they had taken from local farms and had been driving with them. There were sheep as well, so maybe they were butchering them as well. I don't know how long it takes to butcher a cow and barbecue the meat and onwards and so forth, but we estimate like an hour and a half. Maybe that's quick, but the British also realize like time is of the essence right now. Yeah, you got to feed their troops, but Americans are mobilizing. Some British troops, and it's speculative, but I tend to agree with Keith Jones, probably loyalists. They know the area, men from Brown's Corps, maybe with a local grievance against the gristmill owner, Keeler, but they find this mill or direct troops to this mill a little from the campsite. They possibly marched by it on the way. There's still debate of which road was taken, but in any case, because you can see another road to the right of this red line. But in any case, the British target Keeler's mill. They find flour, Indian corn, other grain, flour, and just destroy the whole mill. And again, not where fighting took place, but a notable event where evidence of which are probably there archaeologically. So this would be a contributing property, which we're, as well as this campsite. There's no fight at this point in time. There's no combat here at this resting point, but the Ridgefield Historical Society would very much, want to survey this area. The Park Service would like to know, is there evidence of this encampment or the destruction of Keeler's Mill? And as I rested, Worcester's divisions on the march on that overland route that we looked at earlier, only a few miles away. Arnold's divisions on the march towards Ridgefield Village, and they're en route, and they'll be getting there shortly around 1 o'clock or so. So there's a lot of moving parts here. So here we are now, finally, into the most, the beginning of what many agree is the beginning of the Battle of Ridgefield proper. But again, I'd argue it has begun the minute the British marched out of Danbury. So the real first large engagement between American and British forces, as marked by state of Connecticut marker at the intersection of Barlow Mountain Road and North Salem Road, is what's known as the first engagement. And this is where the British now have begin to move out again. And the column is, again, a half-mile long. And we already talked about the arrangement. And the British, the 1st Brigade and then 2nd Brigade mostly are on the march. They have passed Barlow Mountain Road as the Americans are coming en route. And there's no indication that the Americans strategically held off to attack the rear of this moving British column. Maybe this was exactly the plan, but in any case, American troops that were en route come along Barlow Mountain Road, maybe somewhere along the plains or where the school is today down there, Scotland, the school is it, start to ascend the hill towards North Salem Road, probably deploy from their column into a battle line and overrun the rear of Erskine's brigade. And this rear is essentially the baggage, the wagon train. Each brigade of infantry and cannons are followed by wagons that are hauling supplies and extra ammunition and all kinds of stuff. So Worcester's division of around, let's say, up to 400 American troops, largely Connecticut militia, perhaps some continental units or individuals, overrun and capture this entire wagon train that is attached to Erskine's brigade. So taking effectively half of the British supplies and extra ammunition, and being more of a significant event in the overall battle than maybe that's been realized, because at this point now the British are quite limited on the resupply that's available. This is at the very bottom. This primary source is from a London newspaper, and again, Americans took 40 prisoners, a great number of wagons and horses. We really get into those figures in the report. Long story short, probably a dozen or so actual British soldiers were captured that were guards, and some were wounded, so maybe they were wounded in the wagons. And the other, some odd prisoners, were likely these civilian wagoneers, teamsters that were hired in New York to haul everything. There's no indication of what happened to these individuals, but that might account for these varying numbers. The British, aren't interested in anybody but their regular forces. So in any case, it's hard to tell. Other prisoners were taken throughout the Danbury, expedition, so it's hard to figure exactly how many people were captured, but at least, 12 to 15 British soldiers and other civilians. So moving on, what's known as the second engagement, because I'm running out of time here. I don't know how many people I'm putting to sleep or if anyone's still with me here, but the second engagement, Worcester's division now reforms and gives, closely pursues the rear of the British after securing the wagons, probably detaching guards to take care of things there. And scattered fighting occurs along North Salem Road as far as we know. Probably along Decorah as well. I mean, this fighting probably spilled over into the fields, and British may have been marching down that road anyway. Archaeology will settle that, or probably bring up more questions. Erskine's division understands that there's a substantial American force behind them now. They've lost their wagons, that something needs to be done. The whole division isn't going to stop. They are determined to march south. They're not going to fall for this American trap, I guess you'd say, of slowing down. So they dispatch a rear guard, and they strategically take, it's not as evident today because the road's been graded quite a bit, but there was, by all accounts, more of kind of a rise, a hill. You still see it today as you're just getting, towards Barrack Hill. You can kind of see it on the map there. And the British set up their rear guard there. It was kind of on a height. There was even somewhat of a barricade that Americans had put across there that they were able to reuse. All three of their guns were set up. The Loyalists took the higher ground to the west. And as the Americans came forth in a column, they started taking artillery fire from these light but very potent artillery pieces that could fire 4+ rounds a minute of initially solid shot, those 4-pound cannonballs or 3-pound cannonballs, I should say, that one of which is in the Historical Society. You'll see others around town. Others will be encountered during this project. That would be fired out there, beyond, let's say, 400 yards, 500 yards, 600 yards. As soon as the guns can see this American column, they can throw iron balls, among the troops. Then as the Americans move in closer, they're on this neck of land. If they're all on North Salem Road, we don't know how the Americans are arranged. They may have formed into some sort of linear formation now as they're getting closer, but they're taking now perhaps canister and grape shot, which canister being a bunch of musket balls packed inside literally a tin can and fired in front of enemy positions. It kicks up all sorts of dirt, soil, disintegrates, and all those projectiles just tear into the battle line. As the Americans get closer into about 200 yards, steel grape shot, the size of, let's say, golf balls or smaller, are raking the American lines. So a lot of Americans are getting hit before they're even close enough to start opening fire on the British. And then they're in range of small arms fire. So British infantry is opening up on the Americans. And by all accounts, at this time, Worcester is urging forth his men to take one of these artillery pieces he sees, but the Americans coming around the corner may not have noticed the rest of the forces they faced. I forget who described it as an ambush, and the more I'm thinking about it, it might be, and this is where line of sight studies will be important. But in any case, when Worcester is hit trying to mount second force and urging his men forward, it breaks the attack, and the Americans withdraw, and the British successfully hold their ground. It's not clear how long the fighting takes and to what extent any British casualties are taken, but a number of artillerists are reported as wounded and killed by the time the expedition's over. It could have happened any time, but perhaps some of those casualties happened in this direct engagement between Worcester's division and the rear guard. One big mystery is what happens to Worcester's division afterwards. There seems to be no clear command. There's continental New York, Connecticut militia units. No one seems to really galvanize the different units and press the attack. Again, it's a huge mystery what happens to this division for the rest of the battle. Some of which may have worked their way to Ridgefield and Arnold's division, but there's no sign of them until the next day down around Saugatuck. So as I'm running out of time, let's get through the third engagement that everybody knows the most of. Here's a 3D rendering of topography that Bill Keegan put together. Some of our battlefield maps I'll describe. Third engagement's the most complicated. There's several phases that are well described by Silliman, and you get a sense of it from the other supporting evidence as well. The British remarkably don't write a lot about this. It clearly, well, at least Robinson doesn't want to admit that it was much of a fight. But in any case, when Arnold arrives and his division around 2-ish, there's another 100 troops waiting for him. So now they have, another 100. Yeah. So now their overall force strength is about 500. Arnold decides to deploy this meager force east to west across the Ridgebury Road on this area known as the Stebbins property. And a barricade is also built across the road at this point that anybody that takes the Ridgebury Road back in 1777, as they come south from Danbury Road, they go down a hill, they have to cross a stream. It's probably a little rocky and muddy, and then they have to ascend a steep climb with rock ledges on their right and the Stebbins house and barn on their left. And it's pretty rough land, but naturally defendable. So now with a barricade across it, it's enough to slow any attacker. There's stone walls that can be used as natural fortifications. There's orchards on further to either side of the road that will be used by American defenders. Here's a really great map that our guy Bill Keegan found towards the end of this project in the town hall. Again, local resources are often the most valuable, and this is a copy of an original. So again, Mr. Keegan can go on for some time on the importance of all these early records and even copies. Don't throw anything out, all you town clerks out there. So in any case, this shows the Stebbins house, a barn, stone walls, streams, orchards, everything that's accounted for in the historical record and veterans accounts. The western edge of this line is defended likely by the 2nd Westchester, New York, who's coming from the south as another unit. The center line by, we can reconstruct from veteran accounts. It's held by the 4th Connecticut, the few continental units, probably the Ridgefield local militia and others. These are just the most prominent units we're listing. That eastern flank is held by the 9th Connecticut. I'm seeing I'm running out of time, so I'll just kind of get through here. The 2nd Connecticut, New York, and 9th Connecticut deployed skirmishers in advance of their line, which is kind of very much a common tactic, and slow down the attackers and give advance warning that they're appearing. And we have some really great accounts from two defenders from the 9th Connecticut skirmishers. They call themselves the flank guards. Private Bell were posted north of the Stebbins house, where the road goes to Danbury. We're posted to take the British in the flank as they came down Ridgebury Road. We were behind the fence, 8 to 10 rods north of the Stebbins barn. So, I mean, it doesn't get more detailed than that. As the British start marching into Ridgefield Village and the intersection of Danbury Road, these skirmishers behind the rail fence unload their muskets into the advance guard. The British return fire. It's enough of a sharp fight that another veteran mentions. I was on the flank guards, 5 out of 25 of us. So basically the company were killed in this fight, essentially. They fall back to their main position, most likely to the east on Grove Street. So the Battle of Ridgefield has begun. And it's broken down to 3 phases. I'll get through this because I'm really running out of time. I'd like to take some questions and talk about other stuff. But based on the primary counts, Arnold mentions he only has about an hour to deploy his troops. Silliman mentions that the Americans heard the firing of the 2nd engagement, essentially, of General Worcester attacking the rear, and that the British appeared in one grand column that filled the road for a half mile. That they could hear the music, their drums, drumming and colors flying. So it was a grand, intimidating spectacle, I would think. Robertson, on the British perspective, gets to Ridgefield Village and notes Arnold's posted on the hills, about 700 men, so he overestimates by a few hundred, and that we, British, about 2 o'clock, so about 3 o'clock, our American time, attacked the village and drove them off. That's all Robertson writes about. We showed up, we came, we saw, we conquered. Well, it's a little more detailed than that. So General Silliman breaks this down into these multiple phases that we've identified. That they first began with bringing up all of their guns, all 6 brigade guns, and they opened fire on the American position for upwards to a half hour. As the British Agnew's Brigade deploys skirmishers, this flanking company off to the east, Brown's Corps, maybe half of the overall loyalists start to also form as flanking companies, and the British are testing the American position. And at that time, they're getting fired on by the British guns that are ineffective. They can't hammer down the barricade. They're punching into the Stebbins house, probably not inflicting much damage, but expending a lot of ammunition. At this point now, again, Silliman says the cannonade is 6 field pieces, and this doesn't answer their purpose, so they send large flanking companies and warmly received by our outposts for a while. So that, again, is the fighting taking place on Grove Street when Agnew's Brigade's flanking company is pushing the 9th Connecticut, who has a very strong position. The 9th Connecticut is on elevated ground in an orchard that's surrounded by stone walls. And those of you familiar with town, Grove Street's, where that office complex is, it's still a formidable, steep position. And the 9th Connecticut were easily able, I assume, because they held the entire time, they were able to hold, let's say, off the British regulars pushing the eastern flank. On the west, the 2nd New York also apparently successfully pushes back the flankers from Brown's Corps. More than likely, the British are just kind of probing, so they're not really throwing everything they have. And once they engage, they skirmish and fall back to figure out what to do next. What do they do next? Next is the main attack. So with the cannonade not quite having its effect, and skirmishers testing the flanks. The enemy, the British, according to Silliman, bring up an entire division. So this is Agnew's division, or brigade, I should say, 600 men. Normally it's 750. 150 have broken away and are acting as the Eastern Flanking Company against the 9th Connecticut. Brown's Corps has probably been reinforced. They could have all 300 men, but let's say about 200. And now the main assault's going to take place. Large flanking companies consisting more than our entire force, 3 field pieces in the front. So the cannons are acting as close support to the infantry to start hammering the American position, probably a canister and grape shot. So that's the next phase, is sending out the flankers, sending the guns forth. And then Dibble of the 9th Connecticut, who was in the skirmishing line and fell back, describes the attack as the British advancing in a broad front, which is noteworthy. So the column marches into position and wheels into this long battle line to front the entire American line, to stretch their forces and to also maximize their fire. So it's a long battle line of 600 infantry now pushing up against 200, well fortified Americans. Between a barricade, stone walls, elevated position, rock ledges. It's a pretty strong position. And a hot fire ensues on both flanks. So now everybody's engaged along the line on, in Ridgefield Village. Continued with great fury for about a half hour, according to Silliman. Houses and structures behind the American line are being used as field hospitals. The church is being used as the hospital. Colonel Philbert Bradley's house, no longer standing. Many wounded are being brought there. Captain Coe of the 4th Connecticut, I should say, mentions that, when this large assault was happening, any horses they had were brought up probably to help effect a quick retreat or to move out the wounded in Stebbins' house. And Stebbins, Benjamin Stebbins, I believe, who was actually sick at the time, in his house, stuck in his house in his bedroom for the whole battle, so has a front row seat, mentioned the fight was a bloody one, and he counts between 40 and 50 Americans killed. His house being used as the field hospital, and the dead were buried behind his house. The third engagement, final phase, really the turning point of the battle is when the American line breaks. It occurs based on several accounts on the western flank. Abraham Gilbert, whose house was built upon the ledges, heard a lot of local history. He might be a veteran as well. Mentions that beyond and north of the rocks where his house is was an old orchard under cover of which the British advanced and outflanked Arnold. We believe, again, it was Brown's Corps for a number of reasons. So the Loyalists are able to push back the 2nd New York, and at least a platoon of which scale those ledges that are lightly defended or not defended by the Americans. And according to numerous sources, one of the most famous events of the battle, here from the Connecticut Journal, General Arnold had his force shot out from him. This entire platoon took aim at the general, fired. His force was hit like a dozen times, but Arnold survived. Arnold was pinned by his horse, and here's a period engraving that was popular in England of all places, showing Arnold sort of pinned by his horse, getting up and shooting his attacker that's coming to finish him off. And Arnold retreats at that point, as does much of that west center line. The Americans now have British on their west flanks, on top of the ledges. They've turned the 2nd New York. They're able to start firing down along the American line, and the 4th Connecticut, already pressed by a British bayonet charge, falls back probably in multiple directions, but south, definitely southeast. General Gould, who is the colonel of the 4th Connecticut, is killed in action around the Apple Grove, a clearing of the grove. There's even a description of some of the rocky terrain he was killed near. It might still exist today, and he's trying to rally those troops that are falling back. At this point, and I wish I had the quote up there, the 9th Connecticut is still holding, but I think it's Dibble mentions that once the main American line folds, the 9th Connecticut falls back too. So now the British are in control of the Stebbins property, and there's a general retreat. I wouldn't call it like a frantic run for your lives kind of retreat, but at least the 9th Connecticut's falling back in good order, and there's most American troops are rallying in town. So I know I'm almost about out of time here, and we're almost at the end of the story in any case. Here's some new information that, it's always been suspected based on artifacts, cannonballs that are dug out of town, embedded in structures, but we're calling these the additional engagements. I mean, somebody else can label what they want to call them in the future, and who knows how many engagements are taking place. But as Americans fall back, they appear to fall back along Main Street, along High Ridge to the west, and along East Ridge to the east. Multiple directions. There's probably small pockets of Americans fighting. Agnew's brigade, Brown's corps, they're exhausted. They expended most of their ammunition. So now Erskine's brigade likely takes the lead soon after to try to clear town. There's interesting random accounts here and there of wounded British soldiers found here, and skirmishes there, and cannonballs, found in these houses, during renovations. I thought this account was interesting of a veteran, Levi Bradley, his descendant, stating that Arnold's men are scattered. His grandfather and some others went to a barn. The British turn the field pieces and make the clapboards fly, from probably his grandfather's actual words. They got out and ran for an apple tree. Somebody's hiding behind the tree and either gets pushed out of the way or steps out of the way, gets hit by one of the cannonballs. It just describes a pretty frantic, ongoing fight. Who knows where it's happening? One only has to go to the Keeler Tavern to see a cannonball still embedded in one of these structures where the Americans likely made a stand on the southern end of town, where you see one of those blue boxes. Once the British, and at least 3 regiments are deployed with 3 guns, probably one regiment, 1 gun on each main street. Americans are just pushed back. I mean, they just are spent. There's no, commander really in charge. There's small unit actions probably. But this is the most that Robinson writes about, which is interesting on the British side. Like he barely talks about barricade, but he gets into about the village. After being in the village a little while, the Americans are in the village a little while, the rebels again drew together, came up on a rising ground above the village. Here's the block of Americans down at the south, west corner. And Erskine's division now makes a disposition to surround them, but by different companies not advancing at the same time, they only drove them off. So that's really probably the last formal action in the Battle of Ridgefield, is this occurrence on the hills towards the south end of town. We'll learn more, in the future, clearly through archaeology.
Hey, David, we're bumping up against our end time here. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I'm just going to end it then right now. I'm sorry.
Because I have a few questions that people have asked. I've been saving. Let me start my video here. I've been saving some questions that came up during your talk. And, I wanted to make sure that we get to those before everybody has to leave. And, if anybody's got to go, please, thank you very much. There were questions early on if this would be the recording would be posted later. And yes, this is being recorded and it will be posted on the Ridgefield Historical website. That was fascinating, David. I appreciate it. I'm sorry to butt in, but one thing, just a couple of quick questions came in. The question was it common for the British troops to march overnight? Was it common for them to, I think basically people are asking, was it common for them to move so quickly?
As far as I know, I'm not familiar with every aspect of the revolution, not unless it was, a really desperate situation. I'm sure some accounts that happened in the South. It was noted several times that the British were marching with haste. They knew that time was of the essence, especially after they lost their wagons and a lot of their supplies, and saw what they were up against. They only moved faster. But by the time the Americans somewhat slowed them enough that they were forced to camp overnight at the southern end of Ridgefield. So yeah, as part of the American strategy worked, but not as fully as Worcester would have hoped.
Well, another question, and actually one of the attendees posted a website, but I wanted to hear from you. The attendee wanted to hear from you about the pension records. I think people would be interested to know, is that something like I could or anyone can access the pension records that you've researched?
Yeah, it's just a lot of information about pension records and researching them online. It's done often for genealogy, for joining sons and daughters of American Revolution, and for projects like this. Yes, where Ridgefield is using a website known as Fold3, which does have a subscription, but you can access those federal records there. Otherwise, I don't know what it's like with COVID still, but any National Archives satellite, like up in Massachusetts, you could go to as well. I'm sure there's several ways to access them, but they're increasingly common and very rich.
Yes, our attendee, I'm sorry I missed the name of the person who posted, mentioned Fold3. That's a subscription service, I guess, but still good to know, and we can follow up on that. I did want to note for the audience that another attendee posted that the 5th Connecticut Regiment is the one that's doing the reenactment of the battle on the 30th. And their website is 5cr.org. So just wanted to put that URL out there. Another attendee had asked if this battle took place while the British were trying to split the colonies in two. I don't know if that attendee is still on, but that's the question. I don't know whether you can speak to that. I think it's just about maybe about like where in the war did this happen? I know you covered that briefly, but maybe you just want to.
Yeah, and like just a couple seconds is the beginning of that strategy that is attempted at accumulates in the Battle of Saratoga. That might be what the attendees thinking of. It's in this case not so much. The thought really is to at least knock out some continental supplies and gain some sort of additional loyalist support. Who knows what that form would take, but this actually sort of backfired. I think after that, the British column marching through and the damage they caused and the local sentiments that were raised pro-American, it just, if anything, made it harder to be a loyalist in the region, I guess, after this event. The British also learned they shouldn't march so deep into rebel territory unsupported, and this shows up in multiple correspondences throughout the war to the very end towards Yorktown.
It's I think it was their only attempt, right? Another poster, and this is the beauty of local historians and crowdsourcing facts, I think, because a poster, another attendee mentioned that the lake, and they said Narragansett. No, I don't, Lake Narragansett. Did we mean Lake Narragansett? Was dammed in 1937, and so the current shape of the lake is different than probably what was there perhaps back in the day. So that's just a fact, and I love the fact that people are posting that sort of thing to make note of, Dave, or just wanted to put that out there. Let's see, that's it for the questions from the group. Is there any other? Oh, let's see. We have a couple of QAs, a couple of questions here. Let's see. I think that's about it for us right now, David. So Nancy, did you want to say any last words about the upcoming events?
Oh, thank you. And what we'll do is everybody who's attended tonight will send an email tomorrow and just sort of let you know, because in a month there's the 245th anniversary. We have David and a bunch, the state historian, the state archaeologist, and several other people coming into town. There's a lot going on, so we'll send that to you tomorrow. But nothing more to say tonight. Thank you. I think that's
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. That was excellent. Oh, I do have one question, my own question for myself. This report that you mentioned, is that going to be something that's going to be given to the Historical Society and made available online?
Yeah, as we look,
it's already available.
Yeah, since we close up here, I'd like to again say thank you for the opportunity to share all this. The report at some point, the latest version should be accessible for everybody attending. Thanks for joining us. And you only really missed about 3 other slides where we just really discussed the encampment, which is really the end of this battle, finishing things off, and again, upcoming events. There's a lot happening in Ridgefield and locally in April, and we hope to see you there, and hopefully this provided you with some exciting new background information. So again, thanks again. appreciate it.
And David, you're just before you go, you're going to be demonstrating some battlefield archaeology.
Yep. So on the Ridgefield Historical Society website, you'll see more about the reenactment, the talks. We'll have probably a condensed version of this, I promise. And there will be a heritage consultants will be hosting a battlefield archaeology demonstration at the Historical Society Saturday in the afternoon.
Yeah, that's Saturday.
So come on by if you'd like to learn how to screen some dirt, swing a metal detector, see how we do our stuff, and also landholders that are wondering what will take place. This would be a great time to check it out.
Yeah, I think that'll be really informative session. So thank you very much, David, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. Have a great night.